Chapter 6. Spanish Interlude, 1580 to 1640. Spanish Conquest. Alcázar-Quibir in 1578 led to the end of Portuguese independence 2 years later. Unmarried, Sebastian had no children. His successor, his great-uncle Henrique, Henry II, or Henry I if Henry, Count of Portugal and father of Afonso Henriques Afonso I is not referred to as Henry I, was the fifth son of Manuel I and brother of John III, but he was elderly, ill, far from vigorous, and from 1545 a cardinal. An instance of the way in which the Church, like the military orders and the army, was widely used to provide a livelihood for spare brothers. Henry the Chaste had successively been Archbishop of Braga, Évora, and Lisbon. Childless, Henry sought release from his religious vows so that he could marry, but Pope Gregory XIII refused, unwilling to anger Philip II of Spain, who was the most prominent counter-Reformation ruler. Henry died on the 31st of January, 1580, on his 68th birthday, a very good age for the period, but without having appointed a successor. The succession was disputed. Both Philip II, the uncle of Sebastian, and Antonio, prior of Cratu, a grandson of Manuel I and the illegitimate son of Manuel's second son, had claims. There was also a Braganza claim on the inheritance, but John, the sixth Duke, a claimant through his wife, daughter of the younger brother of John III, and through her mother, did not press the claim. Antonio had been captured at Alcázar-Quibir, but, benefiting from a failure to realize his financial value, ransomed himself. There was a precedent for such a succession, as John I had become king in 1385, launching the House of Avige, despite being illegitimate. However, Antonio lacked much support from the nobility and higher clergy, many of whom had been bribed by Philip II. As with John I in 1385, Antonio's support was more from the lower classes, both lay and clerical. On the 19th of July, 1580, Antonio was proclaimed king at Santarém, but Spanish forces, 47,000 strong, under Fernando III, Duke of Alba, an experienced and determined commander, had already invaded in June. Such a large force was available because in 1579 the Spanish forces in the Low Countries had been withdrawn as part of a peace agreement that turned out only to be temporary. Moreover, Philip could afford to pay for German and Italian mercenaries. This was one of the most successful campaigns of the century, and one that contrasted with earlier Spanish attacks, and with those in the 17th and 18th centuries. Alba, who captured the frontier fortress of Elvas without resistance on the 18th of June, advanced further into Portugal 9 days later. He was supported by a fleet from Cadiz, which landed troops at Cascais. Setúbal fell on the 18th of July. The outnumbered Portuguese under Antonio were heavily defeated at Alcântara on the 25th of August, Lisbon falling 2 days later after street-by-street fighting. Coimbra followed on the 8th of September. The defeated Portuguese fled to Oporto, but failed to rally support, and the city was captured on the 24th of October by a Spanish force under Don Sancho d'Avila, transported by sea. Recognized as king by the Cortes of Tomar, Philip was crowned Philip I of Portugal on the 25th of March, 1581. Antonio had fled to France with the Portuguese crown jewels. In return for the promise to cede Brazil, the French provided support for him, including about 6,000 to 7,000 troops, to establish himself in the Azores, which had a strategic position athwart maritime routes. However, after failure in 1581, Spanish expeditions in 1582 and 1583 brought this to an end, the Spaniards both defeating a larger French fleet off San Miguel on the 26th of July 1582 and making an opposed landing. Antonio fled to France again, and then, fearing assassination by Spanish agents, to England. He died in Paris in 1595. Portugal, one of the world's two leading transoceanic colonial empires, had been taken over by its rival empire, Spain, with relatively little fighting, an obvious contrast to the contest between Portugal and Islam. This outcome reflected the primacy of the dynastic theme in 16th century European politics. The destruction and exhaustion of the House of Avís, with the death of Sebastian, the death of Henry, and the absence of effective claimants, entailed the end of a Portugal independent from foreign control. False Sebastians were hunted down and killed by Spanish agents. Belief in them reflected the hope of returning independence to Portugal. Spain was anyway far more powerful than Portugal, which, with the Casa de India empty, was bankrupt. As in the 1890s, serious financial problems hit hard at Portugal's ability to maintain its interests. Indeed, in the late 1560s, operating from Mexico, the Spaniards established themselves in the Philippines, even though it was on the Portuguese side of the delimitation line agreed by the Treaty of Saragossa in 1529. Portuguese navigators worked for Spain. Thus, Évora-born Pedro Fernandes de Queiroz, 1563 to 1614, was chief pilot in an unsuccessful voyage to colonize the Solomon Islands in 1595, and established a settlement in 1606 at Big Bay on the north side of the island of Espiritu Santo in modern Vanuatu. He named the entire island group Australia del Espiritu Santo, as he believed he had arrived at Terra Australis, the great southern continent. The process of dynastic takeover was eased by the willingness to maintain distinct institutions and separate practices and privileges, as also with Scotland and England in 1603, when James VI of Scotland became James I of England. No new state was created by the succession of Philip I, who remained in Lisbon until 1583. Instead, Portugal did not lose its independence in 1580. A legitimate candidate to the throne, Philip established a dual monarchy, two states under one king. It was only with time, and especially in the 1620s and 1630s, under the Count Duke of Olivares, the leading minister of Philip IV of Spain, Philip III of Portugal, that policy became increasingly Iberist. Under the terms agreed in 1581, the regency in Portugal had to be held by a Portuguese individual or by a member of the royal family. When, in 1583, Philip left for Spain, he made his nephew, Cardinal Albert of Austria, his viceroy in Portugal. Albert, who was also appointed papal legate and Grand Inquisitor for Portugal, held the post until 1593. Clerics were viceroys in 1603 to 1608, 1612 to 1619, and 1633. As a variation on the regency stipulations, a governing junta was installed in 1593 to 1600 and 1621 to 1632, in each case with prominent Portuguese members, including the Archbishop of Lisbon in the first and the Bishop of Coimbra in the second. Philip had established a Council of Portugal in Madrid in order to provide advice. This was on the pattern of conciliar government used by Philip. There was no issue with difference in religion, as when Sigismund III of Poland, ruled 1587 to 1632, became King of Sweden in 1592, only to be deposed in 1599 after a civil war that began in 1597. Indeed, the period of the Spanish monarchy saw a revitalization of the Portuguese church, with the introduction of Italian-style reforms, including a better trained and more attentive parochial clergy. Philip is part of the sequence of Portuguese monarchs depicted in statue form in the arcaded gallery alongside the San Gonçalo Church in Amaranta, a gallery that commemorates those who ruled while the monastery was under construction. Elsewhere, however, the Spanish rulers are not so favoured. Thus, in the 18th century Bishop's Garden in Castelo Branco, the statues of monarchs stand guard on the balustrades, but the Spanish monarchs are half-size. Indeed, there remains an ambivalence in Portugal about the period of Spanish rule, an ambivalence that was strongly seen from 1640, when the period ended. That ambivalence has not altered in recent years. War in the Spanish system. Rule by the kings of Spain greatly compromised Portuguese imperial activity, security, and expansion, and that was despite Portugal being linked to the strongest European empire. After 1580, Portuguese resources were in large part deliberately used to further Spanish interests in Europe and elsewhere. This process had its most dramatic form in 1588, when the Spanish Armada against England sailed from Lisbon, while the brunt of the subsequent battles, notably that off Gravelines, was borne by Portuguese galleons with their heavy firepower. Philip had gone to war with England in 1585, a war that continued until 1604, while the conflict with Dutch rebels lasted from 1566 to 1609. Moreover, Philip intervened in France in a full-scale fashion from 1589 to 1598. Spain and its empire was put under great pressure from this combination of opponents and crises. The Armada led to an English counterblow in 1589, one designed to destroy the remnants of the Spanish fleet. At the same time, the presence of Antonio offered the prospect of driving the Spaniards from Portugal and gaining commercial access to Lisbon. This aspiration was the motivation behind the substantial funding put up by merchants from the City of London. The result was the worst possible compromise. The force made a successful landing at Benicia on the Atlantic coast, some 50 miles from Lisbon. Hopes that the countryside would rise in support of Antonio, however, proved totally unfounded. As the English troops trekked across the countryside towards Lisbon, losing men all the time to heat exhaustion and disease, Francis Drake, at the head of a squadron, sailed to the mouth of the Tagus, but he failed to force his way past the forts guarding the entrance to Lisbon. Had the expedition sailed directly for Lisbon and seized the forts by an amphibious assault, as Alba had done in 1580, Lisbon would probably have fallen, and with it the whole of Portugal. So also, if Drake had forced his way past the forts and attacked Lisbon from its undefended waterfront. Indeed, in 1587, Drake had carried out extensive surveys of the estuary, sending barks up to the port under cover of darkness. However, multiple aims and objectives, combined with a lack of vision or conviction on the part of Elizabeth I and of the commanders, squandered opportunities, and nothing was achieved, unlike in 1596, when Cadiz was stormed by an Anglo-Dutch force. Even had Lisbon fallen, Philip II would have been able to mount a powerful counterattack. The cityscape. Lisbon was captured pictorially in 1598 in the 5th volume of Civitates Orbis Terrarum, a multi-volume atlas by Georg Braun, the editor, Georg Hufnagel, an Antwerp-based Flemish painter, and other contributors. Dominating the skyline in the centre is the fortress of Castelo São Jorge, while the cathedral and the Ribeira Palace, which was to be destroyed in the earthquake, is prominent. The plan is accompanied by a key identifying 140 features. The Baixa is depicted with its original medieval street pattern. Rather like modern Portugal, there are windmills on a nearby hill. The shift in the use of Portuguese resources to the service of Spain was of great importance, because prior to 1580, Portugal had enjoyed a significant window of opportunity. It had not been involved in the Italian Wars and the related Franco-Habsburg struggle for predominance of 1494 to 1559, nor in the wars of religion stemming from the Reformation. Thus, unlike other European states, Portugal, with its narrow demographic base, had been able to devote its military resources to extra-European activity. It had thus achieved a military situation that prefigured the position of Britain for most of the century after victory at Waterloo in 1815, as an expansionist power on the edge of Europe and relatively disengaged from that continent's struggles. In contrast, when Portugal became part of the Spanish system, it was targeted by attacks on that system and became a tempting victim due to the wealth and apparent vulnerability of the Portuguese Empire. Prior to 1580, Portuguese global military economic organization had already faced many difficulties. These became much more acute after 1580. Whereas English attacks on Portuguese trade prior to 1580 had been small-scale and essentially on the Guinea coast, thereafter Portuguese possessions were directly affected by the upsurge in English attacks on the Spanish maritime and colonial world. The East Indiamen, large carracks carrying enormous wealth, were attacked by English fleets as they sailed through the Azores en route to Portugal. In 1591, the Madre de Deus was captured and the Santa Clara destroyed by a fleet of English privateers off the Azores, although a third carrack, the San Bernardo, evaded another English force and arrived safely in Lisbon. After this, Portuguese ships avoided the Azores on their return journeys from the east. The first English ship in the Indian Ocean arrived in 1591. The Edward Bonaventure, captained by James Lancaster, who had earlier served the Portuguese, captured 3 Portuguese ships in 1592. Lancaster went on to command a fleet that captured the Portuguese base of Pernambuco in Brazil with great booty in 1595, and to command the first fleet of the English East India Company, formed in 1600. The Dutch also became a serious threat. Philip banned Dutch trade with Lisbon in 1594, encouraging the Dutch to seek spices at their Asian sources. In 1596, the first Dutch fleet reached Bantam in West Java, and in 1602, the Dutch first landed on Sri Lanka, challenging the Portuguese position there. In 1605, local rulers received Dutch help in driving the Portuguese from Ambon, Ternate and Tidore in the Spice Islands. Moreover, the Portuguese now lacked the diplomatic independence necessary in order to consider how best to respond to such attacks. The threat of attacks on the coast, which included the English sacking of Faru in 1596, led Philip to order defence precautions, such as the fortifications begun in 1592 to protect the port of Viana do Castelo. The ramparts can be visited there. In addition, the citadel built at Setúbal in 1595 was designed to protect and control the Sadu estuary. The growth of a slave sugar economy. The period of Spanish rule saw a major growth in a slave sugar economy based in Brazil. Slavery was long-standing in Portugal, being found under the Romans and Moors. Thus, raids on Lisbon, 1189, and Silves, 1191, each yielded the Moors about 3,000 slaves. In turn, after the Reconquista, enslaved Muslims helped provide workers, notably agricultural labour in the south. Expeditions along the coast of West Africa were motivated by a search for gold, but securing slaves soon became significant. The Portuguese found it difficult to gain entry into the gold trade from the interior of West Africa, but they did so, in part because slaves became useful as a commodity to sell in exchange for gold, rather as the British were later to use Indian opium in China. Moreover, and more significantly, alongside the use of slaves for trade in Africa, the Portuguese also exploited them as a labour force in Portugal and on the developing sugar plantations of Madeira. Between 140,000 and 170,000 slaves were exported to Portugal or Madeira from 1441 to 1505. In Portugal, most worked in domestic service. By the mid-16th century, about a tenth of the population of Lisbon and the Algarve were slaves, although the percentage in Oporto was only about 5. Lagos in the Algarve became a slave market. Slaves were brought in during the 15th century, and indeed up to the 19th century, to cultivate rice and work in the salt fields in the Algarve and the Sado Valley. They built on the use of Muslims as workers and compensated for the movement of Portuguese overseas. Genetic studies have revealed high sub-Saharan maternal lineages, one of 2010 in Alcácer, producing a figure of 22%, the highest in Europe. The sub-Saharan source of slaves encouraged the Italian commercial and financial interests that had been significant for the trade in slaves from the Black Sea, which was cut by the Turkish advance, to transfer their expertise and capital instead to the new Portuguese-controlled African slave trade. Like the Black Sea trade, the new one involved permanent overseas protected bases for trade, long-range shipment by sea, and the ability to invest capital for returns that were not going to be made for a while. The role of Italian intermediaries was shown when, in 1470, Bartolomeo Marchionni, the agent for a Florentine family involved in the Black Sea slave trade, moved to Lisbon, from where he developed sugar plantations in Madeira and gained from the Crown a privileged position in the slave trade on the Guinea coast. Physical prowess was a key element in the assessment of slaves by the Portuguese. This criterion was important because the spread of sugar cultivation, an arduous task, became a leading prompt to the slave trade. This was thanks to the establishment of plantation slavery on Madeira, which in the 15th century became the leading producer of sugar in the Portuguese world. This provided a pattern for Brazil. The alternatives were limited. The enslavement of the native population was a crucial source of labour, but the natives either fled before the raiders or resisted them. Moreover, some of the areas in the Brazilian interior into which raids were conducted were distant from the coastal centres of agriculture. As a result, native slaves were most important in frontier regions, notably Amazonia, that were distant from the coastal points of arrival of African slaves. Failure in Morocco meant that raising slaves from the Moors was no longer an option, as it had been in the 15th century. Portuguese peasants were moved to Brazil, but this proved a limited resource, and one not suited for the arduous labour regime in the sugar plantations. In contrast, moving peasants to the Azores and Madeira, where tasks were less arduous, was more successful. Brazil rapidly became the leading producer of sugar in the Portuguese world, enjoying as it did a major advantage due to slave labour, as well as a lengthy harvest season, comparatively mild weather, and relatively fresh, that is, uncultivated soil in plentiful quantities. Indeed, the seizure of lands with fresh soil was crucial to Western expansion in the Americas. The number of sugar mills in Brazil rose from 60 in 1570 to 192 in around 1600. The initial emphasis was on native labour, but this was hit hard by a smallpox epidemic in 1560 to 1563 and by a measles epidemic in 1563. As a result of a shortage of labour, the Portuguese turned to importing slaves from West Africa and Angola. The northeast coast of Brazil, the centre of sugar production, and its ports, such as Recife and Bahia, were close to Africa, which underlined the capacity of oceans to link rather than divide. This was a key aspect of the Portuguese world. Relatively short slave voyages were particularly valuable because they reduced the need for credit in bridging the period between the purchase and sale of slaves, while death rates among the slaves were generally lower on shorter voyages. By the mid-1580s, about one-third of the slaves in Brazil were Africans, and by 1620, as a result of the growth in the slave trade, they were in a majority. In the last quarter of the 16th century, about 40,000 African slaves entered Brazil in a trade that provided revenues to the crown, as, aside from slaves moved on the royal account, private slave traders were taxed. Developing at a major rate from the 1570s, sugar production helped ensure that Brazil alone received 42% of the slaves imported into the Americas during the 17th century. Indeed, the number who arrived in Brazil exceeded that of the white settlers. This flow was necessary because, on the sugar estates in Brazil, slaves had a life expectancy of fewer than 8 years. The profits of slavery encouraged the further expansion of Portuguese Brazil, and notably so along its northern coast, where the captaincies of Ceará, Maranhão, and Pará were founded in 1613, 1615, and 1616 respectively, and new settlements included Belém do Pará in 1616. As with São Paulo, this was settlement to the west of the demarcation line under the Treaty of Tordesillas. The white gold sugar economy of Brazil brought Portugal great wealth, but also made it a target. After the expiry of a 12-year truce agreed in 1609, war between the Dutch and Spanish resumed in 1621. Portugal was therefore a target. The Dutch focused on northeast Brazil, where they captured Recife in 1630. This effort and success reflected the relative value and vulnerability of the Portuguese colonies. The disruption to sugar production in Brazil due to the war led to a marked shift in production to the West Indies. This was part of a wider crisis in the Portuguese Empire. Thus, in 1637, the Dutch captured São Jorge da Mina, which they renamed Elmina. The Portuguese never won it back. Also in West Africa, Chama, Fort São Sebastião, was lost to the Dutch in 1637, Ashim in 1642, and Accra in 1659. None were regained. Indeed, the contest in West Africa became that between the English and the Dutch. The Dutch also attacked the Portuguese positions in Asia, although they failed at Macau in 1622. The attack by the Dutch was an aspect of a more general pressure on the Portuguese Empire. In 1629, Malacca survived a major assault by Sultan Iskandar Muda of Aceh, in large part thanks to help from the Sultan of Johor, but Hormuz fell to attack by Abbas I of Persia in 1622. It had lacked adequate artillery. Moreover, hostile English action ensured that Hormuz lacked naval support. In Sri Lanka, the Portuguese were put under great pressure from the inland kingdom of Kandy. In 1630, at Randaniwela, the Portuguese army on the island was ambushed and the captain-general killed. In 1638, there was another defeat and the death of another captain-general. In 1640, joint attacks by the Dutch and the Kandians led to the fall of the Portuguese-held Galle and Negombo. The end of union. The strains of these conflicts put pressure on the links between Portugal and Spain. So also did the heavy financial demands of the latter, as it faced sustained conflict in the 1620s and 1630s against France as well as the Dutch and German princes. These demands placed a strain on assumptions about fair kingship. These assumptions were also under even greater pressure due to the economic depression that affected most of 17th century Europe. Agricultural productivity declined, while taxation demands and those for troops fell on a stagnant economy. Indeed, in 1628, a tax on linen led to rioting by women in Oporto. Hostility to Spain became more apparent. Philip III of Spain, ruled 1598 to 1621, Philip II of Portugal, had neglected Portugal. only visiting it in 1619 in order to have the Cortes affirm the succession of his son, and doing so with the protection of Spanish troops. He favoured Spaniards for posts there. Moreover, in Portugal as elsewhere, Philip IV of Spain ruled 1621 to 1665, Philip III of Portugal proved less adroit than his grandfather, and his focus on appointing Spaniards in Portugal was highly unwelcome. He also broke the guarantees made by Philip I of Portugal. An awareness of the problems posed by Spanish rule was driven home by Dutch attacks on the Portuguese Empire. Other states were also in serious difficulties, notably Britain, where rebellion in Scotland started in 1638. In the Spanish world, rebellion began in Catalonia in May 1640. As a result, the troops in Iberia were focused on trying to suppress the rebellion there. This provided an opportunity for rebellion in Portugal, while the demand that Portuguese nobles join the forces preparing to act against Catalonia forced them to make a choice. There had been rioting in 1637 across southern Portugal, beginning in Évora with opposition to new taxes. There was a full-scale rebellion on the 1st of December 1640 on behalf of Portuguese independence, which was expressed in terms of the claims of one of Portugal's leading nobles, the hesitant John, 8th Duke of Braganza. John had claims on the throne through his grandmother, Catherine, a granddaughter of Manuel I, whose claim had been mentioned in 1580, and through his great-great-grandfather, a nephew of Manuel. The key element was that of opportunity. An unpopular, vulnerable Spanish administration proved unable to resist. In the coup that was staged by the 40 conspirators and their supporters, Miguel de Vasconcelos, the Secretary of State from 1635, and one of his juniors were murdered, and Margaret of Savoy, the Viceroy from 1635, a cousin of Philip III of Portugal and a descendant of Manuel I, was allowed to leave for Spain. She had been sent to Lisbon because she outranked John, whom the Spaniards had tried to get out of the way by appointing him to posts in their empire, only to meet with his refusal. The somewhat politically quiescent John, a musician of talent, had refused to back the rioting in 1637, and he was not at the forefront of the 1640 conspiracy. His being summoned to Madrid brought it forward. The key backers of the rebellion were lesser nobles, the lower clergy, the Jesuits, and the Archbishop of Lisbon. French agents encouraged the discontent. Margaret was made to sign orders to the Spanish garrisons to surrender their positions, and all did, bar Ceuta and Angra in the Azores. John was declared John IV of Portugal on the 7th of December 1640. The result was war, a conflict that lasted until 1668. This restoration of independence is commemorated in central Lisbon with the obelisk erected in 1886 in the Praça dos Restauradores. The obelisk records the names and dates of the battles in the War of Restoration, while the bronze figures on the pedestal show victory and freedom.